Right now, across the country, there are general aviation airports quietly disappearing. Not dramatically. Not with a big press conference or a ribbon cutting in reverse. They just stop being airports. The runway gets cracked, the fuel truck breaks down and doesn't get replaced, the FBO closes its doors on a Tuesday morning, and nobody opens them again on Wednesday. The T-hangars sit empty or get converted to storage. The grass grows through the asphalt in places you'd never have seen a weed 5 years ago. And then one day, a county commission votes on something that most of the public never even reads about, and another airport that's been part of its community for 70 or 80 years quietly becomes an industrial park, or a housing development, or just overgrown field waiting for the next rezoning cycle. That's not a dramatic story. It doesn't show up in the news, but it is one of the most consequential things happening in aviation right now, because every one of those closures sends ripple effects through the entire general aviation ecosystem in ways that most people in this industry don't fully trace out, and nowhere do those ripples hit harder and more financially than in aircraft values. Used airplane prices, new airplane demand, the cost of insuring what you already own, the ability to actually fly the mission you bought the airplane to fly in the first place. All of it gets touched by what happens to the airports underneath the whole structure, and that connection is almost never talked about with the seriousness it deserves. So that's what this one is about. We're going to walk through why general aviation airports are genuinely struggling to stay open right now, what the forces are that are pushing against them, why those forces are stronger today than they were a decade ago, and then exactly what that means for aircraft values, used and new. Because the connection between airport infrastructure and what airplanes are actually worth is more direct, more mechanical, and more urgent than most buyers and sellers in this market appreciate. Before we get into it, subscribe, because I cover the financial and infrastructure side of general aviation in a way that most aviation content never touches. And if you want to understand where aircraft values, operating costs, and this market overall are actually headed instead of what the enthusiast press is cheerleading about, you are exactly in the right place and you do not want to miss what's coming next. Let's set the stage properly, because you need to understand the scale of what we're actually talking about before any individual piece of this makes full sense. The United States has, depending on how you count it, somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 general aviation airports. Not commercial airports with jetways and TSA lines, but the smaller ones, the ones with a couple of runways, a handful of hangars, maybe an FBO if you're lucky. The kind of place where your local flying club lives, and where the regional charter operation keeps its twin, and where the agricultural spray plane gets fueled between runs. Some of them are thriving. Some of them are genuinely dying. And the ones in the dying category aren't dying because aviation stopped mattering. They're dying because the specific financial and political environment around general aviation airports has shifted in ways that make keeping one open dramatically harder than it used to be, and the people in a position to keep them open are running out of reasons to fight for it. We've lost hundreds of these airports over the past several decades. The number gets cited in different ways depending on who's doing the counting, but the trend is real, documented, and continuous. And the pace of closure has not meaningfully slowed, even as general aviation activity has picked up in certain segments during certain periods. If anything, the pressures that drive closures have intensified because the underlying economics of running a small airport have gotten substantially worse, while the competing uses for that land have gotten substantially more valuable in many of the markets where these airports happen to sit. Let's start with why keeping a general aviation airport open is genuinely hard in the current environment. Because it starts with money, and it almost always stays there. General aviation airports are expensive. Not airline terminal expensive, not billion-dollar capital program expensive, but genuinely, seriously expensive for the communities and entities that own them, which is usually a county government, a municipality, or in some cases a state authority. Runways need to be maintained, and a runway that looks basically fine from the air can need significant resurfacing or reconstruction work that runs well into the millions of dollars, depending on length and condition. Lighting systems age and need replacement. Instrument approach systems require maintenance and periodic certification. Fuel farms need environmental compliance work and periodic tank replacement. Hangars need roofs. The list of capital expenditures that a well-maintained general aviation airport requires on a 15 to 20-year cycle is longer and more expensive than most county commissioners appreciate when they're writing the annual budget. Here's the part that creates the fundamental tension. Most of that cost falls on the public owner, meaning the county or the city, But the revenue that comes back from a general aviation airport to offset that cost is modest, often quite modest, relative to the capital requirement. Fuel flowage fees, hangar rents, landing fees at the airports that charge them, tie-down fees, the cut of whatever the FBO is generating, all of that together, at most small airports, doesn't come close to covering what it actually costs to keep the infrastructure in good shape. The gap has to be filled from somewhere, and that somewhere is usually a combination of FAA Airport Improvement Program grants and local government general fund contributions. The FAA grant money is real and meaningful, and for a lot of small airports, it's the only reason capital improvements happen at all, rather than getting deferred until something actually fails. But FAA grant funding comes with strings, detailed strings, about what can be built, what the airport has to keep available to the public, and how the airport can and cannot be used or disposed of. Those strings are designed to protect the airport and keep it open, and they do that job, but they also create friction with local governments that might prefer more flexibility in how they use the land, and they require administrative capacity and staff time to navigate, which smaller counties often don't have in abundance. So the grant program is simultaneously the thing keeping a lot of airports alive and a source of regulatory overhead that strains the relationship between some airports and the local governments technically responsible for them. Now layer onto that a specific dynamic that's gotten significantly worse over the last decade, which is real estate pressure. General aviation airports occupy land, sometimes a lot of land. A typical general aviation airport with a 5,000-foot runway and room for hangars and ramp space might sit on 300, 500, even more acres. In rural areas where land values are modest, that's not a particularly controversial use of public property. But over the last several decades, population has shifted, metro areas have grown outward, suburbs have pushed into what used to be rural fringe, and a lot of the airports that were built in the 1940s and 1950s on the outskirts of town are now sitting in the middle of some of the most valuable residential and commercial real estate in their county. When a general aviation airport sits in the middle of a hot real estate market, the pressure from developers and from fiscally minded commissioners is constant and relentless. A developer who needs acreage for a residential subdivision or a distribution center or a commercial development looks at an airport and sees land that the county is actively subsidizing from the general fund. That generates relatively modest economic activity by the square foot compared to alternatives, and that serves what looks from the outside like a small, affluent recreational community rather than the broader public. That pitch lands differently in a county commission meeting depending on who's in the room, but in a lot of markets, it's a persuasive one, and the aviation community often doesn't find out the conversation is happening until it's already fairly far along. The airports most at risk right now are not necessarily the ones in the worst physical condition, although physical condition matters. The ones in the most genuine danger are the ones that sit on land that's worth a lot to alternative users, that have FBO arrangements that don't generate robust revenue, that are located in counties with tight general fund budgets and politically active development interests, and whose user base, the local pilots and flying clubs and small operators who actually use the airport, aren't organized or politically engaged enough to show up effectively when the commission starts asking hard questions about the airport's future. That profile describes a lot of airports, more than most people in the industry realize, and every time one of those closes, the surrounding system gets a little bit tighter for everyone else who's still flying. Let's talk about the FBO situation specifically, because this is a layer of the story that doesn't get enough attention, and it's genuinely important to understanding why airports that look fine from the outside can be in real trouble underneath. Fixed base operators are the commercial service providers at general aviation airports. They sell fuel, they provide ramp services, they rent hangars, they sometimes provide maintenance, aircraft rental, flight instruction, charter. The FBO is often the only revenue-generating commercial entity at a small airport, and the health of the airport's finances is deeply tied to the health of its FBO arrangement. The FBO business has been consolidating dramatically. Large chains have bought up individual FBOs across the country, and where small independent operators used to run fuel trucks and hangar leases with local ownership and local accountability, you now have large corporations making portfolio decisions about which locations justify continued investment and which don't. When a large FBO chain looks at a portfolio of locations and one of them isn't generating enough throughput to justify the cost of the fuel farm, the staffing, and the capital maintenance, they have options an independent operator doesn't. They can exit the location, scale down services significantly, or simply not reinvest when equipment ages out. Any of those outcomes is devastating to the host airport, because without an FBO, the airport loses retail fuel sales, loses the service revenue that supports operations, and often loses the administrative presence that makes the airport feel operational and alive to visiting pilots. An airport without a functioning FBO isn't necessarily closed, but it starts to feel like it, and that feeling is self-reinforcing. Pilots stop routing through airports where fuel isn't available or where the services are unreliable. Traffic drops. Revenue drops further. The case for continued public investment becomes harder to make to the Commission. The spiral is real, and once it starts, it's genuinely difficult to reverse. This is happening at airports across the country right now. Not at every airport, not uniformly, but the trend of FBO consolidation pulling services away from smaller, lower throughput locations has left a meaningful number of airports operating with degraded services that make them less useful, less attractive to base tenants, and progressively easier to argue against in budget discussions. And the airports that lose their base tenants, pilots who pay monthly hangar rent and tie-down fees and buy fuel regularly, are the ones whose revenue base collapses quickest, because transient traffic alone almost never covers the cost of running even a modest airport. Now let's add the environmental and liability layer, because this is one that's grown significantly in importance and isn't going away. General aviation airports often have legacy environmental liabilities that are complicated and expensive. Decades of fuel handling, oil changes, solvent use in maintenance shops lead from leaded avgas settling into soil around the fuel farm and on the runways themselves. These are real environmental conditions that exist at many older airports, and when a county government starts thinking seriously about its long-term liability exposure as the property owner, the environmental picture at an older airport can become a genuine argument for closure rather than continued operation. Getting out from under an environmental liability by closing an airport and selling the land is not always the financially smart move. Sometimes remediation is actually cheaper than demolition and redevelopment, but it gets presented that way in budget discussions more often than it should, and commissioners who aren't airport specialists don't always have the information to push back effectively. There's also insurance liability in the general sense of the word, the liability that comes from being a public airport operator responsible for what happens on your property. When an accident occurs at a general aviation airport, the airport owner is often named in the resulting litigation regardless of whether airport management or infrastructure had anything to do with the cause. Liability insurance premiums for public airport operators have moved upward with the general trend we've seen in aviation insurance across the board. And for a small county trying to balance a tight budget, the insurance cost line item for the airport becomes one more unfavorable number on a balance sheet that already doesn't look great. The political environment around airports has also gotten noticeably more difficult in certain communities, and this matters because airport survival is ultimately a political question as much as an economic one. Airports make noise. That's unavoidable. Airplanes are loud, and while noise abatement procedures help, they don't make a flight school pattern work or an agricultural aircraft operation silent. In communities that have grown up around airports that were once rural and are now suburban, the neighbors who've moved in over the years often have no relationship with aviation and every reason to be frustrated about the noise, the traffic, and what they perceive as a subsidy for an expensive hobby. When those neighbors organize and show up at commission meetings, their political weight can exceed the weight of the flying community that actually uses the airport, particularly if the flying community isn't organized or isn't showing up. This dynamic has played out repeatedly, in different communities, in different ways, but the pattern is consistent. Airport gets surrounded by development. New residents have no connection to aviation. Complaints about noise and traffic accumulate. Local political pressure builds to reduce airport activity or explore alternative uses for the land. The aviation community, often caught off guard or underestimating the political seriousness of the situation, mobilizes later than it should. In some cases, organized pilots and airport advocates manage to hold the line and preserve the facility. In too many other cases, they don't, and another airport starts the process of transitioning out of the aviation system. So that's the threat environment airports are operating in. Now let's talk about what it actually means when one of them closes, because the direct impact goes well beyond the inconvenience of needing to drive to a different airport. The first and most immediate effect when a general aviation airport closes is a geographic coverage gap. General aviation airports are spaced across the country in a way that, historically, made sense for the range and capabilities of the airplanes using them. When one drops out of the system, the pilots and operators who depended on it don't just redistribute evenly among remaining airports. They often redistribute in ways that create real operational constraints: longer ground drives, reduced access to certain parts of the service area the closed airport was covering. For agricultural operators, this can fundamentally break a business model. A spray operation that could refuel quickly at a nearby airport and get back to the field might now be facing a round-trip fuel run that eats a significant chunk of the working day. For air ambulance operations, airport closures reduce coverage precision in ways that have genuine public health implications. For the private pilot flying between two rural communities, the closure of the intermediate airport might stretch a comfortable flight into one that no longer works with fuel reserves or aircraft range. This geographic degradation of the system is cumulative. Any single closure, by itself, might be manageable for most affected users, even if it's genuinely painful for some. But closure after closure, year after year, slowly tightens the mesh of the airport network in ways that make the overall system less capable, less redundant, and less attractive as a transportation option. The airplane that was practical for a certain mission profile starts becoming impractical when the supporting infrastructure assumptions behind that profile keep changing for the worse. Now, here is where we get directly into what airport closures do to aircraft values, because this is the financial core of the story, and it's more specific and more mechanically interesting than it might first appear. The value of an aircraft is not determined solely by the aircraft itself. This sounds obvious when you say it, but in practice, a huge amount of how aircraft are bought and valued treats the airplane as an isolated object, with intrinsic worth, determined by its age, condition, total time, and avionics. What gets undercounted systematically is the value of the infrastructure around the airplane, where it can go, where it can be based, what services are accessible to keep it flying, what the cost of operating it from a given location actually is. All of those infrastructure variables are real inputs to the total cost of ownership and therefore to the price a rational buyer should be willing to pay. When infrastructure degrades, the effective cost of ownership goes up, even if the airplane itself hasn't changed in any way. And when effective cost of ownership goes up, rational buyers pay less. That's not theory, that's just how discounted asset values work. Let's be specific about the channels through which airport closures affect aircraft prices. The most direct channel is based aircraft displacement. When an airport closes, the aircraft that were based there need to go somewhere else. They get trailered, flown, or in some cases simply sold, because the owner's situation has changed enough that continuing to own the airplane no longer makes sense under the new operating reality. The pilots who were basing at the closed airport had specific reasons they were basing there. It might have been proximity to home, proximity to their business, low hangar costs at a less competitive market, access to a particular mechanic or maintenance shop, or simply familiarity and routine built up over years of flying from that location. When the airport closes, some of those pilots find a workable alternative at a nearby airport and successfully transition. But some of them don't. The hangar wait list at the nearest surviving airport is too long, the commute is too far, the cost differential between their old arrangement and the available alternatives is large enough to break the economics of ownership, or the timing just happens to coincide with other life factors that make continuing ownership feel like too much effort. Those pilots sell, and when a batch of owners from the same geographic area all start selling at the same time because their airport just closed, local supply in that market increases, and prices feel pressure. This is a small and localized version of the dynamic, but it's real and it's repeatable every time an airport closes. The larger and more economically significant channel is what airport closures do to the underlying demand case for aircraft ownership in the affected area. Think about how a potential aircraft buyer thinks about the purchase. They're not just evaluating the airplane, they're evaluating whether owning an airplane makes sense for their life and their location. Part of that evaluation is, where am I going to base this thing, and does that location work for how I actually want to fly? If the airports within reasonable driving distance of where they live and work are in good shape, well-maintained, with functional FBOs and reasonable hangar availability, the ownership case gets easier to make. If those airports are declining, if fuel availability is inconsistent, if hangar options are thin, if the infrastructure feels unreliable, the ownership case gets harder, and some number of people who would have bought airplanes in that environment simply don't, because the supporting infrastructure they need to make ownership practical isn't there or doesn't feel stable enough to trust with a large capital commitment. This is a demand destruction mechanism that doesn't show up in simple supply and demand charts for aircraft, because it manifests as purchases that never happen rather than purchases that close at lower prices. But the effect on the market is real. Fewer buyers, spread across more sellers, produces downward price pressure over time, just as surely as direct supply increases do. And the mechanism is geographic, which means it concentrates the price impact in exactly the areas where airport infrastructure has degraded most, creating regional valuation disparities that are directly traceable back to infrastructure quality, even if no one in the transaction is consciously framing it that way. There's a third channel worth understanding, which is what airport closures do to the cost structure of flying from remaining airports, and how that cost pressure translates into ownership economics. When an airport closes and its traffic redistributes to surrounding airports, those surrounding airports get more activity. More activity is good for airport economics in principle, but in practice, it creates congestion and infrastructure strain that can degrade quality of service rather than improve it. Hangar waitlists at surviving airports get longer as displaced pilots from the closed airport try to find new homes. Longer waitlists mean higher hangar prices as scarcity drives rates up. Higher hangar prices mean the monthly cost of aircraft ownership goes up for everyone at that airport, not just the displaced pilots who just arrived. FBO services can get stretched when a location suddenly handles meaningfully more traffic than it was staffed and equipped for, and service quality suffers in ways that affect every customer. More fundamentally, in markets where hangar scarcity has become acute, pilots who cannot find hangar space face the choice of keeping their airplane in a tie-down where it faces weather exposure and higher maintenance costs over time, or selling the airplane because ownership without proper shelter has become financially impractical. In some major metropolitan areas, hangar waitlists aren't measured in months, they're measured in years, and the shortage is directly traceable to the closure of airports that used to provide hangar capacity and no longer do. That hangar shortage is itself a reason pilots sell airplanes, which puts additional supply pressure on used aircraft markets and keeps downward pressure on prices in those markets that wouldn't exist if the underlying infrastructure hadn't been depleted. Let's talk about what specific categories of aircraft feel these infrastructure effects most sharply, because not all aircraft are affected equally by airport closures and network degradation. Lower performance single-engine piston aircraft feel the geographic limitation most acutely. A slower single-engine airplane is the most dependent on a dense airport network, because its range per tank of fuel is more limited and its weather capability is most constrained. The classic $100 hamburger, a short recreational flight to a nearby airport for lunch and back, that activity depends entirely on there being interesting, functional airports within an hour's flight in multiple directions. As that network thins, as airports that used to be fun destinations close or degrade to the point where the fuel truck doesn't work and the restaurant is shuttered, the recreational appeal of owning a simple piston airplane in that area genuinely diminishes. Owners who bought their Cessna or Piper partly for that recreational flying life find that the activity they imagined, a whole regional network of destinations within easy range, has contracted, and some of them reassess whether continued ownership is worth the cost. That reassessment produces sales, and those sales create supply in a market that's simultaneously losing some of its demand case. Agricultural and utility aircraft operators, on the other hand, face a different version of the same problem. These are working aircraft, not recreational tools, and for their operators, the issue isn't the fun of flying to nearby airports, it's the operational logistics of getting fuel and maintenance access in geographically specific rural areas. An agricultural aircraft, based at a small rural airport that closes, doesn't have unlimited flexibility to relocate. The airplane needs to be near the fields it's serving, not at the regional airport 40 miles away. If a replacement basing option doesn't exist in the right geography, the business model breaks, not metaphorically but literally. Operators who can't find practical alternatives sell equipment. Sometimes they exit the business entirely. The loss of agricultural aviation capacity from airport closures has been significant in certain agricultural regions, and the aircraft values in those segments reflect the thinning demand from operators who can no longer make the logistics work. Vintage and antique aircraft feel airport closure effects in a specific way related to maintenance infrastructure. Older aircraft, particularly those with older power plants and systems, need access to mechanics who understand them, and those mechanics tend to cluster at airports with established maintenance cultures. Older airports with long histories of general aviation activity, where knowledge and tooling have been building up for decades. When one of those airports closes, it's not just the physical facility that disappears. The mechanic shop goes with it, the avionics guy who's been there forever goes with it. The network of people who know how to sign off work on a particular old type certificate goes with it. Owners of older aircraft who lose access to that support network face significantly higher maintenance costs and travel burdens to get work done, and some of them decide the economics of owning a vintage airplane without local support infrastructure don't make sense anymore. They sell, and the buyers who might otherwise be interested in the same type in that area face the same infrastructure gap, which constrains demand. Now let's talk about what airport closures do to the insurance picture, because this is another direct and underappreciated mechanism connecting infrastructure health to aircraft economics. Insurance underwriters are not sentimental about aviation infrastructure. They look at quantitative data about where losses occur, under what operating conditions, and in what geographic contexts. As the airport network thins and pilots face longer legs between fuel stops, more diversions to unfamiliar airports in weather, more operations from airports with degraded lighting and approach systems, the risk profile of general aviation operations shifts in ways that underwriters can measure. If the data shows that operating conditions have gotten objectively more challenging in certain regions because of infrastructure degradation, premiums follow. And we've already established in detail how premium increases affect aircraft ownership economics and aircraft values. There's a subtler insurance mechanism too, which operates at the fleet level rather than the individual aircraft level. Flying clubs and flight schools are a significant source of training and rental aircraft utilization, and they depend critically on airport-level infrastructure, clubhouse space, maintenance access, instructors willing to base there, student access to the airport. When airports that have historically supported flight training operations degrade or close, training organizations lose their physical foundation. They shrink or fold. The aircraft that were being used for training and rental get sold. That supply hits the market all at once from the liquidation of a club or school fleet, and the volume of that hitting the market in a localized area can create meaningful temporary downward pressure on certain aircraft types and price ranges. This has a second-order effect on the insurance market that works in exactly the opposite direction you might expect. As flight training infrastructure degrades, as training airports close, as flight schools consolidate or fold, as the pool of active certificated pilots shrinks in certain regions, insurance underwriters face a less experienced overall pilot population on average, because the pipeline that produces newly trained, regularly current pilots is producing less. Less experienced pilots on average, as we've already established, means higher loss rates, and higher loss rates produce premium increases. So infrastructure degradation contributes to the insurance cost spiral through a training pipeline mechanism that's entirely separate from the direct operational risk mechanism, and both of them push in the same direction: higher costs, more difficult ownership economics, more motivated sellers, more price pressure on aircraft. There's something I want to dwell on for a minute here, because it's the piece of this story that I think is most underappreciated by people who are active in the aviation community and care about the future of general aviation as an institution. Airport closures are not reversible. That's the critical asymmetry. Building a new airport from scratch in the United States today is, for all practical purposes, not a realistic option for general aviation. The environmental review process alone can run a decade or more. The land acquisition in developed areas is prohibitively expensive in most markets. The FAA grant process requires airports to demonstrate that a new facility won't duplicate existing capacity in the area, which means, paradoxically, that closing existing airports makes it easier to justify new ones theoretically, but also depletes the advocacy and political infrastructure needed to actually pursue one. No county commission that just sold off a GA airport to a developer is going to turn around and spend a decade fighting to build a replacement somewhere else. What this means is that every airport that closes is a permanent reduction in the capacity of the system. The network doesn't self-repair. The infrastructure doesn't grow back when conditions improve. When an airport is gone, it's gone, and the pilots, operators, and businesses that depended on it have to adapt to a permanently reduced system. That's different from a market downturn in aircraft prices, where the fundamentals can eventually support a recovery. Infrastructure loss doesn't recover on the same schedule as market psychology, because infrastructure loss is structural in a way that asset price movements are not. This matters enormously for the long-term value trajectory of general aviation aircraft, because an aircraft's value is ultimately supported by an ecosystem of airports, services, trained mechanics, available parts, trained pilots, and insurance capacity. That ecosystem has been under steady structural pressure for years, and aircraft values that look reasonably strong in today's spot market are pricing in an ecosystem that's somewhat more intact today than it will be in 10 or 15 years if current trends continue. That's a valuation risk that isn't being priced clearly in most used aircraft transactions right now, because most buyers and sellers are focused on near-term comparables rather than long-term infrastructure trajectory. Now let's talk about what the response from the aviation community looks like, because it's not nothing, and understanding what's actually working and what isn't matters for anyone trying to assess where this goes from here. The AOPA Airport Support Network has been one of the more effective organized responses to airport closure threats over the years, a network of volunteer advocates who monitor airports in their regions and engage with local political processes when closure threats emerge. The model works reasonably well when threats are identified early enough and the local aviation community is organized enough to show up effectively. It's saved airports that would otherwise have been lost to development pressure or budget decisions made without meaningful aviation community input. State aviation organizations in certain states have also been effective advocacy forces, working to ensure that state aviation trust fund money, fuel taxes paid by aircraft operations, gets directed back toward airport preservation rather than getting swept into general funds. This is a real and recurring fight in multiple state legislatures, and the outcomes vary significantly by state, based on how well organized the aviation community is and how sympathetic the political environment happens to be. At the federal level, FAA reauthorization cycles produce recurring debates about the level and structure of airport improvement program funding, and general aviation airport funding has historically been vulnerable to pressure from commercial aviation interests that want to concentrate federal infrastructure money on commercial airports rather than spreading it across a much larger number of small general aviation facilities. The politics of this are complicated, and there are legitimate arguments on multiple sides, but the practical effect of inadequate AIP funding for small airports shows up directly in deferred maintenance, aging infrastructure, and the gradual degradation of facilities that eventually tips the cost-benefit calculation against continued operation. What hasn't worked as well, historically, is reactive advocacy. Aviation communities that don't engage until the closure threat is already advanced and the political situation is already largely determined. Part of what makes airports vulnerable is exactly the disconnection between their importance to aviation and their visibility to the broader community. Airports that are just there, that pilots use routinely without any particular drama or celebration, don't build political capital the way airports that are actively engaged with their communities do. Flight schools that do community outreach, airports that host events, facilities that have built relationships with local businesses and governments over years of positive engagement. Those airports are harder to close politically because they've built a broader constituency than just the pilots who use them. The airports that are purely functional but invisible to non-pilots are the ones most vulnerable to losing the political fight when it comes. There's an economic development argument for airports that has historically been underutilized in preservation fights. And it's worth understanding because it's one of the more effective tools available. General aviation airports generate measurable economic activity that extends well beyond the airport fence. The business traveler who flies privately into a regional airport instead of driving 4 hours. The agricultural operator whose business depends on aircraft-based services. The manufacturer who cites a facility partly because of good access to a general aviation airport for executive travel. The tourism activity drawn to a region by pilots who fly in for events and recreation. All of that economic activity shows up in tax revenues and employment statistics that matter to the county commissioners deciding the airport's fate, and in markets where that economic impact has been rigorously quantified and clearly communicated to decision makers, the airport tends to fare better in budget fights than in markets where the economic impact exists, but has never been properly measured or articulated. The aviation industry has gotten better at this kind of economic impact documentation over the years, but there's still a significant gap between the airports where it's being done well and those where the economic case is being made poorly or not at all. That gap is one of the most actionable things the aviation community can work on, because a well-documented economic impact study presented to a county commission by credible local business voices makes a different kind of argument than pilots showing up to say they really love their airport and would prefer it stayed open. Let's talk about geography, because airport closure risk is not uniformly distributed, and knowing where the highest risk areas are matters for anyone making aircraft purchasing decisions or long-term basing decisions. The airports at highest risk right now are, as I've described, those sitting in real estate markets where land values are high and development pressure is strong, those in counties with tight general fund budgets and politically active development interests, and those with thin user bases and weak FBO economics. That profile concentrates risk in specific geographic patterns, exurban areas around major metropolitan cities, where airports that were once rural are now surrounded by residential development. Certain Sunbelt markets where rapid population growth has dramatically increased land values around airports that were built in the 1950s on what was then the edge of town. And some rural agricultural communities where farm consolidation and changes in agricultural aviation economics have reduced the operational base for small airports that were historically supported by ag aviation activity. What this means practically for aircraft ownership decisions is that if you're evaluating where to base a new airplane for the next 10 to 15 years, the infrastructure risk at your intended home airport is a legitimate input into that decision, not an afterthought. An airport that's in a high-risk profile, surrounded by development, in a county with tight budgets, with a thin user base and weak FBO economics, is not a guaranteed closure, but it deserves a more skeptical eye than an airport in a stable rural community with a strong agricultural aviation base and a county commission that actively understands and values the airport's economic role. This sounds like a somewhat abstract consideration, but it has concrete financial implications. If you base your airplane at an airport that closes in year 4 of your planned 15-year ownership period, you face immediate costs to relocate, potentially a hangar shortage at your fallback option, and possibly a changed ownership calculus that leads to a forced sale at whatever price you can get, rather than a planned sale at a time of your choosing. The financial impact of that scenario on total ownership return can be significant, and it's a scenario that's worth taking seriously, given the documented trend of closure rates over the past 2 decades. Now let's zoom into the new aircraft market side of this story, because airport infrastructure doesn't just affect used aircraft values. It shapes the entire demand structure for new aircraft production, and understanding how shapes the picture of where new airplane prices and sales are headed. Aircraft manufacturers selling into the light general aviation market, piston singles, light twins, personal turboprops, are selling into a market whose depth is directly supported by the infrastructure underneath it. The addressable buyer pool for a new general aviation aircraft in a given region is not just a function of how many people can afford the airplane and want to fly. It's a function of how many of those people have practical access to basing, fueling, training, and maintenance infrastructure that makes ownership realistic. When that infrastructure degrades, the effective addressable market shrinks, even if the wealth and the desire to fly don't. Manufacturers are discovering this in some markets, where demographic demand should be supporting stronger new aircraft sales than they're actually seeing, and part of the explanation is that potential buyers in those markets are running the practical ownership arithmetic and concluding that the infrastructure doesn't currently support the investment. This is a genuine long-term risk to new aircraft production economics, which already operate on thin margins over small production volumes with enormous certification cost burdens per unit sold. If the addressable domestic buyer pool shrinks over time because infrastructure degradation is taking marginal buyers out of the ownership pool, manufacturers don't have an easy substitute. Export markets help, but have their own complications. Charter and fractional use of aircraft generates some demand for production, but not the same kind of broad retail demand that individual owner-pilot purchases represent. The infrastructure health of the general aviation airport system is, in a real sense, foundational to the long-term commercial viability of general aviation aircraft manufacturing, and it's being treated as a background condition rather than an active business continuity concern by most of the industry's commercial stakeholders. There's also a new aircraft pricing dimension here that runs in an interesting direction. As airports close and existing airports face operational pressure and cost increases, the cost of operating a general aviation aircraft in aggregate goes up across fuel prices, insurance, hangar costs, and maintenance. As operating costs go up, total cost of ownership calculations become less favorable, and buyers are pushed toward either simpler, cheaper aircraft that have lower operating cost structures or out of ownership entirely. Manufacturers building at the higher end of the price spectrum, fully loaded piston singles and personal turboprops that were already straining affordability before operating cost increases, face compressed demand from both directions simultaneously. The purchase price is already at or beyond what a large fraction of interested buyers can rationalize, and the operating cost environment is making the ongoing economics look even less attractive. The new aircraft that are moving most reliably are the ones whose operating cost case is strongest relative to their purchase price, and that dynamic increasingly favors simpler, more fuel-efficient designs over feature-loaded performance airplanes that cost a lot to buy and a lot to operate. What I want to make sure is clear before we start pulling this together, because I think it sometimes gets lost in discussions that focus on the financial mechanics, is the actual human and community cost of what we're describing. General aviation airports are not just economic assets. They are infrastructure for a specific kind of access to the country that doesn't exist any other way. The pilot who can fly from a small rural airport to a specialist hospital in a city 200 miles away in 90 minutes, a drive that would take 4 hours, uses aviation infrastructure that is irreplaceable for that mission. The volunteer pilot who transports a patient to a treatment center through a medical transport program uses that same infrastructure. The fire detection aircraft that operates from a small mountain airport during fire season, the search and rescue capability based at a regional facility, the agricultural operation that keeps rural economies functioning in ways that ground vehicles simply can't replicate across the distances and terrain involved, all of these capabilities rest on the physical infrastructure of general aviation airports, and every closure is a reduction in those capabilities, not just an inconvenience for recreational pilots. When airports close, some of those capabilities get reduced or redistributed to longer distance alternatives that are operationally less efficient. Some get lost entirely. That's a community and public interest loss that doesn't appear in any aircraft valuation model, but it's real, and it's part of what makes the conversation about airport preservation genuinely important beyond the financial dimensions. The aviation community, for all its passion and technical sophistication, has historically done a mediocre job of communicating the breadth of what general aviation infrastructure provides beyond recreational flying. The recreational flying case is real and legitimate. Flying as a hobby is valuable. The freedom and capability it provides matter. But leading with the recreational argument in a political context where public resources are constrained puts the aviation community in a defensive position, arguing for a subsidy for a hobby, rather than an offensive position, arguing for preservation of public infrastructure with broad community value. The latter argument is both more accurate and more politically durable, and the airports that have made it effectively are the ones that have fared best when the political pressure came. Let's talk about what this all means if you're trying to make a smart financial decision related to aircraft right now, because that's where this comes back to the practical. If you own an aircraft currently and you're thinking about how long to hold it and at what price to eventually sell, the trajectory of airport infrastructure in your region is a relevant input to that timing decision. This doesn't mean you should panic sell because a nearby airport has some budget challenges, but it does mean that the assumption that your region's aviation infrastructure will remain as functional 10 years from now as it is today deserves scrutiny rather than automatic acceptance. If you're in a region where closure risk is elevated, holding an aircraft whose value is strongly tied to local infrastructure, an agricultural aircraft, a vintage airplane whose maintenance support is concentrated at specific local shops, a training aircraft whose value depends on school and club activity in the area, deserves a more skeptical long-term hold assessment than the current resale market might suggest. If you're buying an aircraft and planning to base it in a specific location, do actual due diligence on the airport. Not just a visual inspection of the runway and the hangars. Talk to the people who've been there a long time. Talk to the FBO manager about the throughput trends. Talk to the local pilots about the county's relationship with the airport and whether there's been any recent political conversation about its future. Ask about the hangar waitlist and what it's been doing over the past few years. Whether it's growing or shrinking tells you something real about whether the based population is growing or declining. Check whether there's been deferred capital maintenance that should have happened already and hasn't. None of.